Cool. I think we're going to have to cut that down. Because it was supposed to be absolute max of like 10 minutes. And I think
well, sorry. You're asking me about a manifesto and we just yesterday.
Come on.
Spark notes?
The rest is just noise. So, this past week, over 100 urban sound researchers from around the world gathered virtually for the second Urban Sound Symposium. We had a single stage with keynote talks from 30 speakers, as well as panel discussions and 27 different posters. So to cap off this very successful virtual symposium, Francesco and I are just going to briefly chat about our favorite bits.
Yeah, why not?
So I think I'm going to go ahead and start actually with one of the talks that I really enjoyed.
Okay.
Which actually made me very jealous, which was the first one from the second day, which was from Juan Pablo Bello and David Bernfeld about their noise monitoring networks.
Networks, yes.
So the Juan Pablo was from the Sonic Project in New York.
New York, correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And their approach is that they have like these low-cost Raspberry Pi based sensors, and then they can have, I think, what do you say? They have like 50 out at any time,
yes.
And like they have 100 sensors or 150, something like that.
Yeah.
And so they can just have like this widely distributed thing throughout the city. But then on the flip side was what they're doing in Paris, and I'll let you pronounce the name because it's the Paris. No, not David Bernfeld's name. Yeah. That's fine with me.
Bruit Paris.
That one.
Okay. I didn't get it. I mean,
I can't
why is he asking that?
Because they go with like these sort of more high-tech ones with a 360-degree camera. They call it Medusa. So 360-degree camera with like 4 microphones to get directional information.
Yes.
And they can like identify and have an acoustic camera essentially where they say this is the dominant sound source. Which is they're both super interesting ways to go about doing this sort of sound sensing in cities.
Yeah, from my side, what really impressed me about the New York experience is the amount of data that they are processing. It's like, I think Juan Pablo mentioned at some point, they have like accumulated 55 years of recordings. Jeez. And they're doing some very interesting stuff about labeling and manual labeling. And he mentioned something that they, because that kind of work is focused on, oriented towards also sound source recognition and things like that. Yeah. And he mentioned at some point they labeled like 27,000 fragments. And then he said, even so, we are still like labeling only 0.07% of the amount of data that we have.
And they've done it with like this community science thing, right? Of an online dashboard that you can go in and do this labeling. And they've still, that's incredible.
Yeah.
So I should say, actually, I didn't say up at the top, to everybody listening, we're going to talk about like our favorite bits, but obviously not comprehensive.
No.
There's too much for just the two of us. So it's going to be whatever we found interesting. And if you attended,
it's not like if we don't mention we didn't find interesting, because that's also something.
But if you attended and you think there was a particular one that you really liked, just comment about it. Like you can find us on Twitter. Let us know. If you thought we should have focused on something else. So what was your sort of top level from the talks? What was the thing that sort of stood out to you?
I mean, in my case, I really liked the opening one, the urban trends and their impact on soundscape keynote lecture, which was given by Dick Buteluren and Arnaud Kahn. I felt it really like set the narrative, because they were having this kind of high level conversation about where are we going and what are the trends that we are observing. And they kind of summarize like 3 main topics, and one was of course the emergence of new sound sources during the last century. So today we are facing like new kind of sources, because of course technology is changing and so on, and in the near future there will probably be like drones and things and other kind of aerial noise sources for freight transport and things like that. And then, of course, another trend, another important topic they identified was mobility. We don't know what's going to happen with mobility. Of course, we are going electric in many cases, but maybe that's not the only solution.
And I do think that, I think it was Dan Steele made a comment that, like, yeah, it's really exciting that we can move to electric cars, which are, you know, nearly silent compared to petrol cars, but it's still only at what, like 1% or something at the moment.
Still take ages before,
Yeah, we've still got a long way to go before we get to that point. But it is exciting to think about a city where that's not the dominant noise source anymore.
Yeah.
And what do we do when that happens?
Indeed. And then another topic they mentioned was about actually the proper living dimension, like our living spaces, and how, for example, urban sound is contributing to shaping or in some way influencing like environmental justice and inequity in a city. And as in like low income areas being exposed to more noise than higher income areas and things like that. And how this kind of inequities and environmental factors are also converging if we think, for example, about climate change and heat islands, urban heat islands and things like that. So all this kind of multi-level environmental factors that can make life in cities really better or worse for some. So I think that was, one of my favorite. It was also because maybe it was the beginning, the opening of the symposium. It was.
Yeah. So actually, because I really enjoy this bit, I'm going to actually kind of bring us back to sensor networks for my next, the thing that really stuck in my head, which was a poster. You know, we said we had a sort of ongoing poster session from Esther Vidania Vila. I'm trying hard to get pronunciations right. I've looked it up.
Good enough.
And this one was, the title was Prototyping a Low-Cost Wireless Acoustic Sensor Network with Physical Redundancy to Classify Acoustic Events. And so this one was super interesting to me because what she did was take a neural network, which is trained on the Urban Sound 8K dataset, right? So a sort of, that's a fairly standard approach to do environmental sound recognition nowadays. But what she did was distribute it across several nodes and use their neighbors to sort of compare and take advantage of these multiple perspectives on a sound to improve the accuracy of the recognition. I thought that was a super clever way to try and improve these sorts of automated sound recognition methods. Actually, now that I think about it, it kind of reminds me of the gunshot recognition software that had been out. And actually, she mentioned this when I was talking to her, that using the Urban Sound 8K is their taxonomy and training model is based on New York data.
Okay.
Which means they have gunshots as
lot
like
of gunshots.
I don't know about a lot, but like they have it as a class. And she was like, yeah, I don't need that for, I think it was Barcelona, but I may be wrong about that one. I think it was Barcelona that she was training on. I was like, yeah, we don't really need that for our data here in London either. So you kind of have to adjust there.
By context.
Yeah, but it kind of reminds me of that because they were that software was triangulating in order to identify these sorts of things. So what's your next one on your list?
I definitely have the public space soundscapes, 3 continents, 3 approaches one, which was a joint keynote by Sarah Payne, Hyun Jo, and Daniel Steele. So these 3 researchers came together to bring their own experience about collecting soundscape data and working with people about urban sound in 3 different countries, specifically the UK, Korea, and Canada, of course. And it was very interesting to see how they approached their methodological challenges in different ways, and whether we could extract any kind of difference in terms of cultural difference, whether the methodology itself, the way we collect data is itself in its on its own a cultural difference in how we approach the topic of urban sound. So I really like that, because they were presenting data, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I think it's super important for us to be looking at not just one context, right? We can sometimes get, particularly like us here, we're always in London now under COVID, we get locked down in our own particular little backyard, and bring that conversation wider was super, super interesting. But actually, this next one's kind of coming back to our backyard. So my next one from the poster session was from Maria Luisa Carvalho.
Yes.
So close. In Salford, which was an online experiment looking at Manchester soundscapes.
Yeah.
Although I believe she was carrying it out with Brazilian Portuguese.
Yeah, the
speakers.
sample was Brazilian Portuguese people, yes.
And so there were a couple of different interesting things she was looking at, like the differences in responses between the Brazilian Portuguese speakers in the lab and I believe the English respondents in situ, and how they responded differently. But then also looking at the crowdedness, how the crowdedness of the different sites influences how vibrant or eventful people's ratings are. And I found that quite interesting. And one of the things that she particularly noted was the effect of crowd density is different in different locations, which we haven't really spoken about our own work all that much on the podcast yet. So our listeners may not know this, but you certainly do. Considering all of the differences across the different locations in our analysis is like a constant harping from me. And so that was super interesting and to hear about, and seeing that she was looking at these different degrees of response. Same thing, again, a thing that Daniel Steele mentioned in his talk about people in different contexts, not just do they find it more pleasant or less pleasant, but how likely are they to answer at the extremes versus in a more neutral way, which was, again, part of what she was looking at. So your next one?
My next one is, again, a keynote, and this time it was given by Pierre Romand and André Fibig, and the topic was mapping and prediction. So I really liked it because I like maps, but that's probably my issue. But yeah, the point they were making was about the whole noise mapping culture is about mapping indeed noise and the sources, and we are used to this kind
levels.
of levels and this kind of specific sources, and specifically annoying sound sources. So it's like road traffic and rail traffic, aircrafts, and so on. But they were trying to shift the discourse towards more, first of all, more dynamic representations, which is a big limitation of conventional noise maps. Like generally, the way we understand noise map is just a screenshot of a specific moment or a long-term average. Like this is how the environmental noise directive works. Which is probably, so it's useful for some goals and for some specific targets, but it's of course not representing an accurate picture of what the sound environment is really like in a city. And
was that the one where they showed a little GIF of a car passing by a building, and they had the noise map like every second or something updating, so you could actually see the movement of the sound source through the noise map. Exactly,
and that's much more useful first to understand what's going on at a specific location, but also if you wanted to track specific users and the exposure of someone moving throughout the city and during the day. So it's much more useful. And then also mapping other kind of sources, not necessarily unpleasant ones.
Yep.
And then I think they were kind of hinting also at mapping perceptions. So at some point there was something like calmness maps and things like that. So I think that could also be a very important way forward, because eventually, apart from the noise exposure, we also want to see how specific areas of a city are understood and perceived, and what's the feeling of the people there.
I mean, that's the challenge going forward, though, is we want to start mapping perception, but how you actually do that is a massive challenge.
Yeah, and they were also trying to make the connection with the prediction problem. Yeah. Which is the whole it's a story on its own about the modeling and what are the relevant indicators and so on. Yeah. So
my final one actually that I'm gonna bring up actually goes back to exactly what you were saying about mapping these dynamic noise maps and paying attention to those sorts of sources. It was from a poster from Valentine Lebescon from IFSTAR. Which was an open source modeling chain for road traffic noise exposure mapping. And basically it's this chain of software that uses MATSIM, which is multi-agent transport simulation, to simulate traffic flows as individual agents. So agent-based modeling where each agent which is essentially a car or bus or some other mode of transport, has a desired schedule with like time periods for home, work, shopping, all that sort of stuff, which then are simulated as individual agents on a network, which of course is kind of how it actually happens. So it makes sense that that's how we're doing it, which then gets plugged into noise modeling to do the resulting noise levels to produce this noise map, which isn't just from average traffic flows or from like individual measurement points, which are then extrapolated out, but is actually modeling the individual cars and sources that are moving throughout, which is super interesting to me also because when I was talking to him, he was saying the thing that you could do is not just have that be, in this case, I think they were doing it based on third octave band or on octave bands rather, and then coming down to LAEQ. You could kind of do it with like a recording of the sound source, right? So depending on your computational power, you could add all of these different recordings together and kind of end up with the simulated actual sound that you would have in a particular location. I think that's a really interesting step forward to do this agent-based noise mapping, right? So do you have a couple more, or just one more for your final one?
Yeah, I mean, all of them were so interesting. I'm just gonna highlight this one that was called Participatory Approaches in Urban Sound Studies and was delivered by Mattia Kobianchi, Nadine Schutz, and Lisa Lavia. And I think it was super interesting. And they kind of discussed how urban sound can become or not become a tool for inclusivity in cities. And they were also considering some academic and research related aspects like how research in the field, how inclusive is research in the field. And this triggered a lot of conversation.
I mean, I think Mattia's really interesting point that I don't think I'd ever been introduced before was his distinction between inclusion and not exclusion.
Exactly. They are not the same. They're not necessarily the opposite.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's about being active or passive in any process and things like that. And he was also considering some aspects related to who are the people doing research in the field and who are the people being researched in the field. And what else could we do to make this, again, a more inclusive field of study and topic, and for conversations also at city planning level and so on. Yeah,
so I think as you were going to mention, so some more conversations came out of this.
Yeah.
And I believe there was a group of some early career researchers who were carrying on from this discussion, which I'm really glad we had the right sort of setup to enable that. And so we're actually going to go ahead and cut over and speak to Edda Bild, who hopefully our listeners are familiar with now.
Yeah, another friend of the podcast.
And she's going to talk about some of the things which came out of that discussion, and then also talk to us about the workshops that she led as part of the Urban Sound Symposium. So let's go over to Edda.
Yeah. So in listening to Mattia's presentation, which is of course a long overdue conversation on diversity and inclusion and along a number of lines, Actually, myself and my colleagues, Daniel Steele and Cynthia Tarlau, usual co-authors and partners in crime. There was a lot of, we started having a conversation in parallel about things that we agreed on his point, things we disagreed on, and also finding some ways of challenging Matia's own statements. Of course, there's only so much he could say in a, 15-minute presentation. So of course there would be questions. And so then what we basically did was what you would do at any decent conference. We ambushed him. Actually, he invited us to have a conversation after his talk during the break, and that devolved in.
Because I think during Matthias' talk, Dan raised, or directly after it, Dan raised some interesting sort of critiques and just giving the perspective of why sometimes it is actually so difficult, particularly for people in early stage research, to be able to do the sort of
and
things that Matthias talked about.
Among those things, because I'm assuming that people listening to this are not going to be familiar with those, but for example, one of the points that Mattia was arguing, and very rightfully so, was the fact that we're not really engaging with so-called ideas of oral diversity, or just a general diversity of people we're working with, but in general, it's actually easier to just default to what you just referred to as the white students who need credits or need $10 and then are just willing to do an experiment for us. But then Dan had raised the point that although that is a wonderful idea, of course, it is very difficult for a person who is not trained in certain fields to engage with populations which, if they have been marginalized, then they also have a lot of vulnerability or distrust in academia and whatnot. So then there are other types of soft skills that you need to have in order to create some delicate connections with those communities to then be able to use them as a part of your research. But still, we agreed on the fact that there should be a stronger conversation on positionality and a stronger conversation on, understanding where we're coming from and how that influences how we approach things. So not just from a discussions on positivism and whatnot, but really just, what our background is and how that influences who we consider to be the standard.
So has anything sort of concrete come out of that so far? You mentioned sort of drafting a manifesto and trying to get a viewpoint together.
So honestly, I think, again, what was supposed to be a 5-minute conversation just went into a half an hour screaming into the void, where, a group of other people who get you and understand you. So I think, honestly, like in the case of any type of, let's say, belligerent group, they would first need the first few sessions will be on basically venting and airing grievances. And then I think afterwards that will formalize into something more coherent. Even when we're talking about diversity and we're trying to encourage other types of researchers who come from other types of places other than just, the WASPy world, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, whatever. The standards of publication are still Western. The journals are still very much hosted by Western universities that have their own standards. So it's a bit rich that we're complaining about the fact that we don't have enough people coming from the global South in publishing, but then when we receive their papers, we're very harsh in how do we judge them, or our standards are, are maybe unfair, or maybe we get so much lost into a form that we lose the content, I think, a lot of times.
But then the question I have here is, this wasn't attached to any sort of official body. This wasn't any sort of society. This isn't the Institute of Acoustics or the Acoustical Society of America. This was the Urban Sound Symposium, right? Which was great and had a large number of really great people doing research in urban sound. All the things that you laid out are systemic issues, right? Which is, I think we would agree, like kind of the root issue of all this sort of stuff. So then the question is, this group, which has gotten together to try to address these sorts of issues within urban sound and within soundscape, we can certainly put pressure to change those systemic issues. But what can we do more sort of more immediately within our own research to try to do better? We can't change how journals are approaching, authors from the global South, except for how we review, which is
I think what we were talking about. So as you were mentioning, this started off as just a random conversation, and then we were like, hey, maybe we should formalize this in a manifesto, and hey, maybe we should actually formalize this in a working group. And then there was conversations with the organizers of the Urban Sound Symposium that potentially we can turn this into a longer workshop where we could really have these conversations in a more structured way with a more specific, goal setting purpose. But I think that one thing that we were discussing is, simply the fact that you can acknowledge diversity, and you can just, you can explain the position out of which you're talking, and then acknowledge the fact that your findings are representative for a certain group. But also engaging, that's something that I was talking actually to Professor Guastavino, who's one of the leaders in the soundscape field. And she was saying that, compared to other fields in, for example, psychology or broader, like soundscape research is actually doing quite decent in this aspect.
Yeah,
but still, maybe because we're doing well, we can do even better, right? So we can reflect on our position. We can always try and turn it into a thing to write a couple of sentences on that, and just say, I'm writing from the position of this type of person, and I'm working with this group of people, or more actively try and turn it into a thing to engage with professionals that work with other vulnerable groups, and not turn it into a special research question, but just to acknowledge the fact that people with different, with other forms of oral abilities are just as normal, and I'm using again air quotes here, as other groups, but not turn them into like a special research question, but just acknowledging the fact that they're just as normal, and that our standards of normalcy are actually quite arbitrarily set. So I think that within our own field, we can start challenging what we consider to be normal, and maybe be a little bit more mindful of how we use what we use as normal or standard or average or whatnot.
I can't remember who it was, but someone brought up that there's principles from accessible design, specifically calling out that when you design things to be accessible to, for instance, if you design the urban soundscape to be accessible to blind people, it's also accessible to everybody else.
And that's something that, it's something that's being acknowledged in other fields. Like, I don't know if you were there when we were in that part of the conversation, but we were also talking about the fact like crash test dummies were developed, again, using the body to exactly for you.
Me. That's right. That's exactly
so
right.
It's just, these are conversations that are happening throughout. So I think soundscape as a field that is inherently multidisciplinary and is inherently bringing together people that are coming from a host of fields, we're the ones who should be looking at other fields and say like, okay, look, in product design or in other design, they're acknowledging this diversity, not as oh my God, they're different, but no, on the contrary, if you're designing something for them, you're acknowledging as a functional part of society. If we can write a manifesto and that's something that we make sure it reaches everyone, then maybe we can also change our standards of reviewing. We can change our standards of speaking about or writing about certain things. If we somehow manage to maybe convince the people, talk more with the people that are the actual leaders in the field, right? We're just young scholars, right? We only have sort of the energy to talk about these things. But if we have more of these talks,
I do think that soundscape, as you said, is pretty good. We've got the senior people in our field are very open to listening to early career researchers and to these sorts of discussions. So I think we're quite lucky in that.
But that's exactly what I wanted to say. Like, you saw the reaction, right? They were all like, wow, this is really interesting, right? Exposing them to those concepts and exposing those conversations on our daily conversations with them. We work with them directly. We are tutored and trained by them. So having these conversations, I think, is going to also change the way in which maybe journals are edited, because they will start to also be like, okay, I was made aware of these issues, so let's start. So we're sort of changing the system from within.
As we've sort of touched on, there's a lot of different things in this. There's a lot of discussion to go around to finally sort of distill it down to, I think, a set of principles, goals, and actions. So you said the outcome of this is sort of a working group. I kind of like that it's not really attached to any particular society. It's just a group of people coming together who, want to make use of these things. So if people want to get involved and join this working group, is there any way that they should get in touch with you or with Mattia or with someone else?
Yeah, you can get in touch with me. I did the old fashioned added everyone on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
So so this is very informal for now, but you can send me an email at edda.build@mcgill.ca. You can post the email somewhere.
Yep, we'll put
So
it
if
down in the
anyone,
description.
yeah. So this is really just for now. It's an informal group where everyone gathers and shares their grievances. But I think there's a lot of aspects that are soundscape field related, and there's a lot of aspects that are more related to academic research. But because they're related to academic research, then we can really have the luxury of seeing what conversations are in other fields. The more, the merrier, but also the more people from different fields, the merrier. That would be great.
Cool. So as I said, we'll put some links for contact and all that in the show notes. Okay. Thanks so much for coming back on.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much, Edda, for talking to us again. Always happy to have her on. So just to close out, Francesco, you were actually one of the organizers of the Urban Sound Symposium.
Yeah, I was. Unfortunately.
Yeah, because you definitely don't have enough other things to be doing.
No. That's the point. Yes. Yeah. Let's organize a symposium. But yeah.
So looking back on it as the organizer, how did you feel that it went? Who? First, we should say who were the other organizers?
Yeah, of course. So, so this was co-organized by Ghent University in Belgium, University College here in UK, TU Berlin, University Gustave Eiffel in France, EMPA in Switzerland, and McGill in Canada. So yeah, I mean, again, because this was the second edition and it was an online version, we didn't really know what to expect because the first one was in 2019 in Ghent in Belgium. And this time, we were facing with the challenge that any conference organizers was facing because of the pandemic and online conferences. So we decided we would go weird. We didn't want this to be just another webinar, so we decided to use this platform. Are we allowed to say the name of the platform?
I think so. Yeah. So it's GatherTown.
GatherTown. Okay, we said
which we've used a decent amount within the department here at UCL.
Yeah. So yeah, that was the platform that we went for, and it was a nice way of gamifying the whole experience. And I think it's actually the closest we could get to the real experience you would get in terms of interaction within in presence.
For those who don't know, listening or didn't attend, GatherTown is. I think someone described it as basically like a 90s Pokemon game.
Exactly.
So
that's exactly what it is.
Yeah. You're a little
we
avatar
just stick a conference
around.
on it.
Yeah, I think it worked pretty well. I know some of the feedback that I've had and I've heard is it was very jam-packed.
Yeah.
So not quite enough time for sort of little chats, but as we said with Edda, that there was still the room to go off and have these other side discussions. It's not a replacement, but it worked pretty well.
Yeah, the thing I liked from the back end, I was observing during the keynotes, for example, people were still wandering around the virtual environment, the virtual world, and this is something that would happen also in real conferences. I mean, usually when you go to major conferences like Internoise and things like that, and you get the keynote about underwater acoustics, super interesting, but I'm not sure I'm going to understand anything. So what you do, you grab a coffee and you grab a friend and a colleague and discuss something else on the side. So it was nice to see that kind of interaction happening also in the virtual world. And it also gave us the opportunity to do the first ever virtual worldwide sound walk, which was one of the side activities.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So we had this people using this kind of point of access to literally jump from one city to another without carbon footprint, and basically exploring soundscapes of the world, recordings that had been uploaded and dropped on the word map. That was a quite fun experience. I think people may still be stuck there. And actually, today is one day after the conference, and we noticed that there are still people.
I went in just to double check some of the posters, and there's still 4 or 5 people just wandering around.
We should probably tell them that the conference is over, but
they might be stuck in Berlin on that world map, though.
We'll tell them at some point.
So just to close us off then, this was the second one. The first one was in 2019 in Ghent. So we've got the next one.
2023.
Which we're already planning in 2023. Any idea where it's going to be?
No idea. We'll see. I mean, time will tell.
Somewhere in the real world, though.
Yeah, probably. This world.
Cool. And I suppose, actually, if anyone listening would like to be involved in organizing it, I guess that's open for volunteers.
I guess. I mean,
I don't know.
But be careful for what you wish.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it was great fun.
Cool. Awesome. I had a super fun time. I thought it was some really interesting discussions and studies going on. I particularly liked, actually, a really interesting thing that I don't think I've ever seen at another conference. All the keynotes were like collaboration, presented collaboratively between otherwise essentially unrelated groups, right?
Yeah, they were perfect strangers.
Yeah,
that was also
it wasn't
nice.
like you and I presenting something together.
No. That's great. I mean, because we kind of forced people to collaborate
and to draw a bit of a scientific narrative out of different strains of research.
Yes.
Rather than kind of just all presenting them. That was super good. Anyway, we'll stop rambling now.
Yes.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
We hope to see you at the 2023 Urban Sound Symposium.
Indeed. Bye.
Thanks very much. The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.